Good morning. This is Chris Schlutt from Wisconsin Land+Water. Thank you for joining us for the second in the webinar series of DNR water quality monitoring. I'm going to turn this over to Ashley. If you have any questions during this presentation, please post them in the chat area and she will get to them at an appropriate time. Thanks. If you have any questions for me, you could just send it to me and I can help you out. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Beranek. I am the Integrated Report Coordinator for Wisconsin, and with me today is Amanda Smith, a Water Resource Management Specialist for the state. She will be manning our chat box, so if you have questions for me at any point during my talk, please enter them and she will flag me down and let me know what those questions are so that I can answer them as we go. Today I'm going to talk about Wisconsin surface water quality. If my computer will go, there we go. We're going to look at some of the listing process, the timeline, how we use the impaired waters list. I'm going to go through some of WisCALM, which is our listing guidelines, and some of the background of that. I'm going to look through or show you some of our online tools because we have some great ways to figure out background on listings for water bodies or how you can determine natural communities. And then I'll go over some delisting processes and examples. I apologize if there's any background noise. There are some meetings going on next door and they are a little bit loud. All right, so the impaired waters list, our main goal, or one of our main goals, is to comply with the Clean Water Act Section 303D. So the Clean Water Act 303D says that every state needs to let us know that or let them know what waters in the state are not meeting water quality standards. So what waters aren't healthy at the moment. Another goal is to develop a comprehensive, defensible impaired waters list. So it needs to be based on quality control data, consistently applied methods, and those methods should be based on current scientific knowledge. So every 2 years, we update our protocols for how we assess waters, and we try to integrate any new scientific knowledge that we know of. And lastly, we try to maintain a state-developed list. So we want it to reflect state water resource management priorities, and we want to provide a useful tool for managing our state waters. Another reason to maintain a state-developed list is so that we can ground truth the assessments. I work in the central office in Madison, but when I do the assessments, I send any impairment changes out to all of our regional biologists because they know what's going on with the waters on the ground. I may not know if there was a restoration on a water or if there's been any work done, and therefore some data should not be used, or there may be other factors in the data that was used for an assessment. So maintaining a state-developed list makes sure that it's the most accurate for our water resources. So at its basic, our listing process are these 5 steps. Preparing the listing methods, so that's our WisCALM documentation, compiling our readily available data, assessing that data, and then doing a public notice of the draft list and sending that finalized list to the EPA for approval. And this listing process is a 2-year cycle. So we're currently on the 2018 cycle, and the finalized list is always submitted April 1st of every even numbered year. So it's going to be due on April 1st of 2018. So for the 2018 listing process, we've already gone through preparing WisCALM, we've already gone through compiling readily available data and assessing the data. And the regional biologists have ground truthed it, and we have a draft and we are almost ready for public notice. So hopefully around November, we will be sending out a public list for everyone to review. And then that finalized list will be sent to the EPA for approval. While we're doing the 2018 listing process, we're also working through the 2020 listing process. So this first bullet here, we're going to start preparing the 2020 WisCALM, or the 2020 listing methods, this winter. And I will be going over that a little bit more in a few minutes. And you can see that this list goes, or this process goes all the way through to April 1st of 2020. That's when our next list is due. So the Impaired Waters list, what do we use it for? So it's meant to be a management tool for tracking individual water quality status. So we track cleanup plans, we track the status of TMDLs. Is it in implementation? Is it in development? Does it still need a TMDL? We also look at delisting water bodies as a success story. Some of the benefits of listing are that it provides an impetus for restoration. It also provides funding incentives. So there are federal and state cost share grants that may be available to landowners for projects that address non-point sources of pollution. And some grants provide incentives for restoration of impaired waters. So if you are working on an impaired water, you may be more likely to get funding. So for example, the USDA has Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or the EQIP program. Those grants could, landowners that apply for that have a greater chance of receiving funding if it is on their land is adjoining an impaired water. Or targeted runoff management TRIM grants. Eligible recipients of the grants are selected based on the application of a specific score, and projects that would implement practices that help address water quality impairment for a listed water, that adds 35 points to their score. So it helps the possibility of getting that funding. This is something, the way that the list is not used is that it's not used as a measure of water quality trends. This is something that I'm trying to emphasize to anyone that I'm talking to, just because it can be a common misconception. Changes in the impaired waters list can be influenced by a lot of different factors. Specifically, when there's an updated water quality standard like total phosphorus. In 2010, the total phosphorus rules were put into Wisconsin law. And in 2012, we started using those criteria. So there were a lot more waters listed in 2012 for total phosphorus. It wasn't that there were a lot more waters that were impaired for phosphorus. They were impaired before. It's just now we have a benchmark against which to measure. Another change is assessment methods and technology, and another change could be monitoring strategies. So for example, changes in monitoring strategy or volunteer involvement let us assess a lot more waters. So if you look at the graph on the left, on the y-axis is river stream miles, and on the x-axis is assessment cycle. And I go from 2008 through 2016, and you can see that the number of stream miles we were able to assess for each cycle increased. And if you look at the figure on the right, the number of unique stream stations sampled by WAVE volunteers since 1996. So on the x-axis, we have year from 1996 through 2015. And on the y-axis are the number of stations. It has increased over time. So the more involvement we have from volunteers, because some projects involve volunteers in their strategies, we're able to get to a lot more streams, and that way we have a lot more data and I can assess a lot more. Another update that has been imperative in getting a lot more assessed, a lot more waters assessed, is improving technology. So since 2008, we've been able to automate assessments for a lot of different parameters. And what this means is that we write essentially software that takes the data out of our database. It takes the protocols that we have written in WisCALM and does the calculations for us. Having done some of these parameter assessments by hand, I have to say that it's a lot more efficient to do it with an assessment package. So we have, since 2008, we've created assessment packages for total phosphorus, for chlorophyll, macroinvertebrates, fish, chloride, E. coli, and temperature. And we're still working on creating a few more packages for different water bodies for some of these parameters. And it lets us assess larger data sets and more parameters. While these are really great, that is also another reason that we do have ground truthing, because this assessment package takes the data out of swims. It does take out data that shouldn't be assessed, like anything that's outside of the growing season for chlorophyll, but there may be other factors that the biologist knows about that the assessment package or I would miss. With those automated assessment packages, we're able to assess all of the data. With the assessment of all of the data, we can find out how many waters are good. So this figure here shows the number of stream miles assessed for chlorides in the past 3 cycles, so 2012, 2014, and 2016. That's on the x-axis, and the number of river miles is on the y-axis. So if you see 2012, we didn't assess any, but in 2014, we listed 44 miles, but we found that over 2,000 were in good condition. They supported the use of fish and aquatic life. You'll notice that in 2016, there were fewer good waters because we caught most of them in the 2014 cycle, but there were still more supporting miles than there were listed. And this is an overall trend that we've seen. Of the water bodies that we've been able to assess, which is about 25% in the state, and this includes lakes, rivers, streams, impoundments, all waters that we have, about 82% are healthy. And these are based on the most recent numbers that I have, and about 18% are impaired. It's those 18% that we want to try and improve, but it is good to note that we do have a lot of good waters in our state. I want to jump over to WisCALM because WisCALM is how we figure out what goes on that list. So WisCALM is our Wisconsin Consolidated Assessment and Listing Methodology. It's essentially our go-to document on how we list things, how we choose monitoring stations, how we decide how long an assessment unit should be, and I'll talk about those in a minute, how we should list things and how we delist them based on certain parameters. So data requirements are outlined in WisCALM. We want to have data that is quality assured based on our quality management plan. So this means that we want to have data that's the same, collected in the same way, and it's comparable across the state and across time. We outline a specific period of record that we would like to use. So we usually use the most recent 10-year period. And for the 2018 cycle, that was 2007 through 2016. We also outline the sampling period, and this depends on the parameter that you're looking at. The sampling period for chlorophyll will be different from the sampling period for chloride. And then sampling size. So that's how many samples do you need to actually do an impairment assessment. And this also varies by parameter. To give you an example, this is a table for minimum data requirements on the parameters we do for lakes and reservoirs. So on the left-hand side, we have chlorophyll, total phosphorus, dissolved oxygen, temperature, pH, and toxic substances. And then it tells you how many samples you need, the sampling period, and the protocol. So if you look at toxic substances, you need 2 values within a 3-year period, and you sample year-round. So the reason that you sample year-round is because for a toxic substance, it could kill the fish or bugs or anything that's living in that lake at any point of the year. But for an assessment for chlorophyll A, for example, you need 3 monthly values from each of 2 years. So for an assessment, you need 2 years with 3 samples in each year, so 6 total. And the sampling period is only July 15th through September 15th. So that's the growing season for chlorophyll A. And there's even specific sampling protocol where you would only grab samples from the top 2 meters or top 6 feet of the lake. So that's very specific and very different from toxic substances. So WisCALM is our way of keeping track of how we sample for each parameter. And in comparison, here is rivers and streams. And there are some of the same parameters like total phosphorus DO, but this also has macroinvertebrates and fish. And they have their own sampling periods and the number of samples that they need for an impairment assessment. So for macroinvertebrates, you need 2 samples one sample from each of 2 years. This is so that we can do an average of the 2 IBI scores over multiple years. And there will be changes to some of these in the upcoming cycle, but any and all of those changes will be out for public comment period, and we will be highlighting any and all changes. So the Clean Water Act requires that we use all readily available data. Before we do an assessment, we ask the public for any data that they would like to be used in the impairment assessments. And when we've done that, we've gotten data from the USGS, other state departments, county departments, universities, tribes for any shared waters like the Lakota Ray, regional planning commissions, and major municipal sewerage districts like Milwaukee MSD or Madison MSD. Anytime during the public data solicitation period is when we accept most of this data, but if you ever have any data that you would like to share, I would accept it at any point in time, because any of this data we need to get into our database so that we can use it in those automated assessments. I take data and use it anytime because there's a lot of work for everyone to do, and I know that not everyone can conform to the assessment timeline that we have. So assessment units, I wanted to go over a little bit about these because it's how we list portions of rivers and streams. So assessment unit is a spatial delineation of a water body, usually a portion thereof. So rivers and streams are usually delineated, they're usually less than 20 miles in length. So sometimes a stream, if it's less than 20 miles, it may just be one assessment unit. However, if it's larger, it may be split up by confluence with another stream. It may be split up because there's a change in the use classification, or maybe there's a significant morphological feature. Maybe there's an impoundment in the river and upstream is different than downstream of that impoundment. It may be further subdivided. And if you've ever looked at our assessment units, they don't always follow this these clean rules here of splitting at a confluence or a use classification change. And I call them odd delineations because they don't quite make sense with how the water body is changing or the use of it. And some of these are due to 1980 Trout delineations or outstanding exceptional resource water delineations, and sometimes are impaired waters listings prior to 2010. And as an example, this is Dodge Branch. And this middle section here is a class 2 trout water. In the 1980 Trout book, it's delineated, it's cut off at this Highway W and Highway Y. Now the fish don't really care that there are highways there, but they were landmarks and it was an easier way, I think, to mark where the beginning and end of this section was. So it's not necessarily on a confluence of any sort, but it's in code and this is where we have it delineated. Any changes in this length would have to go through our fisheries biologists and then through code, essentially. So we leave some of these in place because for now it is the way we have it in code. We also have assessment units on lakes and impoundments, and usually, for the most part, a lake is one assessment unit because it's usually one contiguous polygon. However, in this case, this is Balsam Lake, and the regional biologist said this eastern basin is different enough and it's separate enough from the rest of the lake that it should be assessed separately. And it's actually, this eastern basin is impaired and the rest of the lake is not. So in WisCALM, there are guidelines on how you decide if you want to, if you think these should be separate. So as I said, WisCALM is updated every 2 years, and we try to do this, or we do this ahead of the assessments because we use that updated assessment protocols then to do our the next year's assessments. So this is an internal process. It takes about 6 to 10 months, and we started, like I'll be starting this this winter. There is a 30-day public comment period. We highlight all new or updated language, and the comments can cover anything from a specific criteria or a method that you disagree on or think should be clarified, or it could be something as easy as, this language does not make sense, could you please clarify this? And I know that there's a public comment period, and you can comment during that time specifically, but if you guys are ever using WisCALM and something doesn't make sense, please let me know. And I may not be able to make the change until we do this internal process, but any changes or updates that you guys feel would be helpful, I would like to know, because the document is only as good as it is understandable. So I wanted to show a few of the online tools that we have, because for me, if I have all of our internal databases and I can go and find out what's the natural community of this water, or what is it listed, or is it a trout water? Some of this is all available on our website. And this is our water search tool. And I will be going to the actual search tool to show you some of the features of it. But highlighted here, when you go to a water body, you can see its natural community. You can see what segment it is, how many miles. The last year it was monitored. It looks like this one hasn't been monitored in a while or doesn't have any data in our database. And then the general condition. This one has not been assessed recently. So down below on the right, you can see it's in Beranek County. It is a trout water, but it's not an OERW water, outstanding or exceptional resource water, and it's not impaired. So this is a cold class 2 trout water, and its designated use is cold. So if I were assessing this water for temperature, it's a cold water stream. Similarly, here's a lake in the natural community. It's a 2-story fishery lake, and you can see that this one has been monitored in 2017, and it is impaired. And you can see that it's fish and aquatic life, it's default fish and aquatic life. So I will show you what that means in a few minutes. A really great part of this tool is that you can look at the conditions for this water. There will be a note from the most recent assessment cycle telling you when it was placed on the list, what it's listed for, and if there were any changes. And then down below, there are reports. So anything that's attached to this water body would appear here. And then we have these cool little dials here. You can see visually how the water body's doing. So for fish consumption, in Clear Lake, you can eat the fish, and you only have to follow the general fish consumption guidelines for the state. But for recreation, it's considered poor, the conditions are poor, and for fish and aquatic life, the conditions are considered poor. So I wanted to show you on my computer. So this is on our website, and it's the water search tool, and I have this link at the end of the presentation. Any water that you're looking for, you should be able to either search by name or by WBIC and click the search button. I've typed in OK Creek because this is one that I know has some information associated with it. You can click on it on the second link to hit the map, or I'm going to click on the first one. And this is the page that we had just looked at. So this particular stream is not segmented. It only has one. And sorry, you can tell that because I searched for the water body and only one segment came up. So this overview gives you a little bit of information on the water body. There's a historical description, and you can see that it's impaired. And there are 2 notes, one from 2015 and one from 2017. So this talks about the 2018 assessments. It talks about how there was new phosphorus data that it confirmed the phosphorus impairment, but there was no new biological data. So we don't really know if we can delist for that. I should point out that if you want to know what it's listed for, there are 2 places to look. So there's impairments include, so it's listed for degraded biological community, so fish or bugs. It's also listed for degraded habitat. And then the pollutants include total phosphorus and suspended solids or sediment. So when you read these lists, you can see what's been confirmed recently. So this one's, the phosphorus has been confirmed, but we're not sure if the biological community is still good or not, or is still bad or not. And you can see on the right, the assessment is for fish and aquatic life. We don't know how recreation is doing in this particular water body, and fish consumption is good. For this particular water body, because it's impaired, it has this other page. And this page tells you a few more details about this water. It has similar notes, but it also has the comprehensive river and stream assessments. So this is specifically what we used for the assessment. This will have the data, the calculations, anything that you're looking for to back up, that we use to back up this assessment. And then there is further information on the pollutant and impairment listings. So you'll see that sediment and degraded habitat are listed together, and then total phosphorus and degraded biological community are listed together. You can also see that listing notes are included, and you can see when they were listed. So sediment was listed in 2016, and so was phosphorus. So there's all sorts of information here on this page, and it's a pretty good tool. We try to keep all of the data up to date so that you can see what's in here and how the water bodies have changed over time. Another tool that I wanted to show you is our, if you go onto our Wisconsin DNR site and search for Water Condition Viewer, the first result should take you to our Water Condition Viewer page, and you can launch the viewer with this button. I already have it up so that we don't have to wait for it to launch. So this tool is pretty great because it has all of our assessment data in it. So I've put in the different layers for phosphorus, or I've had put in phosphorus, bugs, fish, and you can look at each individual parameter. So right now, if I go under layers and under water quality data, I can look at our Clean Water Act information. So this is what we use for listing. So if you see, we've got, I'll collapse these. We have stream MIBIs, which is macroinvertebrates. We have fish, stream total phosphorus, stream non-weightable stream MIBI, so that's for the larger rivers. We have lake assessments, recreational use, for this is our beaches, and then we also have temperature and chloride. Right now I'm going to show you what the stream phosphorus, fish, and MIBI data looks like. So right now, this is OK Creek. This is a stream that I had up on the water search tool. If you look here, this station has some phosphorus data, and you see that it is red. If you look in or on the left-hand side, red means that the phosphorus data clearly exceeds our criteria. And right now I have it turned on so that you can see what the entire stream's assessment is based on total phosphorus. So it is impaired for phosphorus. If I want to see, when I was looking at this listing, it talked about there being biological impairment observed. But in this note, it wasn't clear whether it was bugs or fish. So I can determine that by looking at this map. So if I look at fish, I have to wait for the layer to turn on, but it will show me what stations on this stream have fish data. So here is a station near the mouth that is good. Here is one on County G that is also good, but over here you can see that there is a station with poor poor bug scores. So this listing is likely based on fish scores because this entire line is red and we have this score. If you want to know the actual scores, there are tools in here. You can hit identify and it will tell you information about that particular score. So there was data from 2014. It'll tell you what kind of natural community was used for that particular fish survey. And I believe it will also tell you the score. Here we go. If I can get it to work correctly. There we go. The value is 20, which is a poor score for that particular water, or for a cool, cold headwater. So this tool will give you a lot of the information that we have for a listing or why it is listed. If we now go look at the bugs, we can see, or the macroinvertebrates, we will see that the scores are a bit different. They're not great. They're all fair. So they're not excellent or good, but they are not poor. So this listing was based on fish. And one thing you could try and do is if you have done any restoration in an area, you could look and see if there are any differences spatially in the fish or bug scores. So for this one, I find it interesting that this poor is also next to these two that are good. So for me, you should know that any assessment is based on the this lowest score. So this is the worst performing station, and it is the basis for this biological impairment, even though there are two stations here that are also good. So there may be something going on here, but there may be some restoration or something that we don't know about. It would be interesting to collect more samples on this water body to find out. This is a pretty great tool that we have, and this is updated every assessment cycle. So every time we have new information, we update it. We also have the surface water data viewer, but it doesn't have, and it has some of the same calculations, but it isn't necessarily directly linked to our assessments. So I wanted to show you guys these tools because they are pretty cool to have. All right, I'm going to go back to my presentation and talk a little bit about water delistings. So I went through WisCALM and I went through assessment units because it influences how we list and how we delist. So when we delist a water, it's based on the same assessment methods as listing. If there are criteria, like for total phosphorus or chloride, E. coli, PCBs, or mercury, it has to meet those criteria in order to be delisted. So for total phosphorus, if it was clearly exceeding at one point, it has to inversely clearly meet those criteria or be clearly below. So if the stream has criteria of 75 micrograms per liter, the mean and confidence interval has to be below 75 in order for it to be delisted. If a water body has narrative criteria, like for taste, odor, or suspended solids or sediment, that's a little bit different. Sometimes we work with factors we can measure, like macroinvertebrates or fish, or habitat scores. Things for taste and odor, those are a little bit more subjective. It no longer has the taste, no longer has the odor, and then it would be delisted based on a write-up based on that information. The biggest factor of delisting is data availability. We cannot delist with old information. We have to delist with new data. When it comes to looking at a pollutant impairment combination, each part of the listing needs to be addressed. So if it's listed for total phosphorus but impairment unknown, it needs to meet TP criteria, so phosphorus criteria. We don't have it listed for anything else, just phosphorus. If it's listed for phosphorus and degraded biological community, like OK Creek is, it would then need to meet phosphorus, fish, or bugs based on whatever it was listed for. However, for OK Creek, if the fish were shown to be good, but then the bugs were poor, we still wouldn't be able to delist the degraded biological community. It needs to show that phosphorus and the biology in the stream are doing well, are doing good, are above the poor thresholds. And for a listing that has phosphorus and excess algal growth or eutrophication, in that case, it's chlorophyll criteria that would need to be met. So one thing about the web page that I pointed out is natural community is two-story fishery lake for Clear Lake. We saw that it was listed for total phosphorus, impairment unknown. For that particular water body in WisCALM, we have a table that shows for total phosphorus, that water body needs to meet 15 micrograms per liter for that lake. And it has to be clearly below the threshold. So this is the this is an example of how we assess against the criteria. So the criteria line is 15 micrograms per liter, and the mean, which is the M in the circle, and the confidence interval around it needs to be below the criteria in order for it to be delisted. In most cases, a listed water is above, it clearly exceeds the criteria. And you can see if a water body is improving potentially by the fact that it goes from clearly exceeds to may exceed or may meet before it gets to clearly meets. So I went and looked for an example of a water body that has been delisted, and I know that this one is familiar to many because it was a very large project in southern Wisconsin. But to me, it seems like a very good example because it shows just how long it takes to get a water body delisted. So this water body was listed in 1998 for degraded habitat based on sediment and total suspended solids. The TMDL for it was approved in 2005, but even before that, restoration work had started. So the Dane County Land Conservation Department had started working on narrowing the streams, doing some stabilization of the bank, creating a buffer from agriculture, incorporating artificial structures for fish habitat. And they did a pilot project, and then they continued that work through 2012. The Wisconsin DNR was monitoring baseline conditions, and there was a USGS gauge installed on Kittleson Valley Creek. The restoration work continued from 2010 to 2014 by public and private partners working with landowners, and they worked to convert a lot of acres of cropland to no-till. They installed barnyard runoff systems and nutrient management plans, and they fenced livestock away from the stream so that they weren't walking in and creating more sediment to flow into the water body. And they also added 14 cattle crossings. So when it comes to assessing how these implementations have improved the water system, or the water health, I should say, in 2003, those restoration efforts showed immediate results on the biology. We could see that the biology through macroinvertebrates and fish were much better just based on that short amount of improvement. So when it came to delisting this water, we looked at the fish community, the macroinvertebrate community, and then quantitative habitat surveys. So those quantitative habitat surveys specifically looked at TSS and showed how much there was less fine silt on the bottom of the stream. And that removal of that fine silt made more room for the macroinvertebrates to actually be able to live in the stream. So their population and their community health increased. And the fish communities with increased habitat area were able to also increase and have a better score when it came to assessing. So this water body was delisted in 2016. And prior to that, one of our regional biologists wrote up the assessment of Pleasant Valley Branch and Kittleson Valley Creek and proposed Pleasant Valley branch for delisting based on all of the information he had found. And this document is used as a reason for the delisting. So this water body was listed in 1998, was being worked on in 2003, had a TMDL approved in 2005, and was finally delisted in 2016. And the EPA finally approved our 2016 list in August of 2017. So it's a lot of work and it takes a long time, but in my opinion, totally worth it. But it's one way to show that I know that delisting is one of the markers of us having improvements, but it does take time. It's one of the reasons that we're working right now with the EPA to show them that in a watershed, there's a listed water, but here are all of the management projects that are going on. So instead of just being marked by it's delisted or it's listed, we're also showing that there's stream bank stabilization being done or cattle crossings being put in, and all of these things will go towards showing that this water body is being improved. So all of the work that we do here at DNR and on this Impaired Waters list and all of our assessments is a collaborative effort. I know that I would not have a lot of the data without help from the public, from you guys, from volunteers. Anything that you guys could help us with, we greatly appreciate it. Any surface water monitoring data that you have, anything from 2009 to today, could be used in the next assessment cycle, which will be the 2020 cycle. So that's going to use data from 2009 to 2018. Any collaboration with our local biologists, which I know is already done as evidenced by the Pleasant Valley project, but something as simple as checking the field thermistors. Sometimes we have thermistors out in the field and there's a storm or they get moved around or they're out of the water. We may not be able to check them as often as needed. We're doing a lot of temperature assessments recently. It's one of our newer parameters that we're doing, and it's one area where we could use help. Share monitoring efforts for special projects. This is really one to talk to regional biologists on. Are there any projects that are being worked on, or are there any projects that you're working on that we could help with? And then work with local lake friends groups to apply for DNR grants or even USDA grants. I think sometimes some of the local groups or friends of groups don't have or don't know what grants they could apply for based on the fact that they have impaired waters next to them, and that could help get them funding. One other is to comment on the draft of WisCALM. Like I said, any comments that you guys have, I will gladly take because I want to make that document as understandable as possible. I want to make it as clear as possible, and we're going to be working on trying to make it as scientifically accurate as possible. The next, as I mentioned before, we are finalizing our list and it's going to go out for public comment. So again, if you could comment on our public, during that public comment period, that would be helpful. And then we're going to be preparing our listing methods and compiling readily available data. So any data you have for us, we would gladly accept. And preparing the listing methods, again, any comments you have on those, we would also gladly accept. Any questions that you have, here's my contact information and some of the links that we went over today. Again, if you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to give me a call or an email. And I will leave the comment box open, chat box open for any questions. Please let me know. Otherwise, that's all I had for you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. If anyone has any questions for Ashley, if you could please put them in the chat box or copy her email and get hold of her at a later time. I'll wait a minute or two before I close this webinar. Thanks. And I also put a link in here. If you could take a minute to fill out this survey, we're going to have a breakout session at our annual conference, and your input will help develop this session. So thanks a lot. And we'll give it another minute here for questions for Ashley.